Step 5 of this IDL course on self-awareness. The early building blocks of computing and thinking about why computing has evolved in the way that it has. What are the fundamental elements for a thinking machine to work and be useful? This next lecture may look as if it's all about computers and the history of computers, but it isn't really. If you look beneath the surface of what it's about numbers and characters and how our senses capture information, record it, process it, sort it, and generally put it into our minds so that it's useful for our own purposes. So it's hopelessly inaccurate in terms of the real history of computing, because digital computing really started in about 1890 with a guy called Horowitz. And the first census computer in the USA, anyway, was produced by a company called Univac. But you won't have heard of Univac, nor's hardly anybody else. So think of it as a journey towards starting to understand your own mind. Don't just see it as me banging on about the history of computing, because that's not the purpose of it. The purpose of it is to start you thinking about how your mind works, what information you collect as you live your life minute by minute and day by day. So bear with it. I'm sorry there's so much about computers, but I actually feel it's pretty well the only way to start understanding to some level of detail how our minds work. Because for most people, that's a complete mystery. We are not going to solve that mystery through looking at the bits and pieces and the entrails, if you like, of what's in your human mind physiologically. We have to start getting into concepts and getting a deeper understanding of what is a number, what is an alphabet, what is a character, why are those useful to help us organize ourselves in our daily lives? Why do we use those kinds of tools in order to translate the real world of experience into stuff we can make useful? So go with the flow, and hopefully by the end of the session, you'll get at least some idea of what we're trying to achieve here. Good luck. Sorry, that was a short interrupt there. Coming back to this National Census in USA. So the federal government looked around, tried to find a company who would build them a machine that could take cards, piece of paper, like that, and on the piece of paper, you'd be able to write the name and facts about the person. It wasn't about money at that stage. It was just the sort of typical census information, how many people in your family, what's your age, and stuff like that. So they found a company, and they said to this company, can you build a machine that'll do this kind of thing? We want you to be able to keep 100 million of these pieces of information. That's 100 million. Now, that's a big ask, because people in those days, you'd have, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 cards in an index card, or maybe 5,000 if you're a big company. So here's this government saying we'd quite like to have a way of holding 100 million items of information about particular people. And the company that made it there was a company, and they did make it, was one of the first commercial computers. I'll call them commercial computers because computers vary whether they're scientific or commercial. So it was a commercial computer. And the guy they talked to say, can you make a machine, was a chap called Tom Watson. I said, here's a chunk of change, a big chunk of change. Will you make a machine? He said, yeah, I can do that. And he formed a company which became IBM. Now, IBM stands for International Business Machines. So he didn't call it like my census adder or whatever. He was a smart guy, a very smart guy. And he used that government money to develop a computer that would be able to keep 100 million pieces of records of people in files. So what he decided was that you could keep numbers and characters, and you'd have them on cards. And just as you have a filing cabinet, hopefully at home, or people kept all their cards, you'd have files. Only these files weren't physical files, they were electronic files. So inside these files, there were records of the numbers and the characters, using characters. At this stage, there were no images and videos and stuff like that. So then the government said, well, what we'd like you to be able to do is, can you develop a way of sorting out information? Because what we'd like to know is, in a band, let's say, of from 30 to 40-year-olds, how many are there in such and such a state or whatever? I expect there are kind of things to do with voting and all that stuff in the backs of their minds. So as well as files, he needed to be able to put them into a database. So you've got several files all going into a database. And then in order to be able to answer questions and give the government the information they wanted, you had to be able to sort information out. Sorts. And he called these sort things utilities. So they're kind of basic level capability. If you imagine you've got 50 packs of cards, ordinary playing cards, each pack's got 52 cards in it, which is 13 cards in a suit and 4 suits and maybe a couple of jokers. Too much detail. But imagine someone throws down 10 packs of cards, all unsorted, and you've got to sort them out. There's a good way and a bad way to do that. I mean, imagine I don't know if you know about playing cards, but you have what's called suits. There's hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades. So if you're going to sort those out, you might sort them out, first of all, into their colors, which are red and black, and then you might sort them out into suits, and then you'd sort those suits out according to the numbers from the lowest to the highest. That would be what's called a sort algorithm. Now, an algorithm is basically the rules you use. And that was a successful business. And in fact, IBM became the biggest computing company in the world. And over the next 10 years, there was IBM plus about 7 other companies came along. Now, those 7 companies were called the 7 dwarfs because they were small companies compared to IBM. So it was IBM and the 7 dwarfs. If that's how you spell dwarf, spelling is not my early schooling in Egypt didn't do me any favors as far as ordinary spelling. I tend to spell phonetically. You may have noticed that, like when I spelled Archimedes and stuff like that. So this eventually became known as Snow White and the 7 dwarfs. It's a fairy story in Western culture. There's nothing Snow White-ish about IBM, by the way. They really were big, bad, hard-nosed business people. So computing started here, pretty much the modern age of computing. And then there are other people who got in on the act. And again, largely driven by America. What can I knock off here? Okay, got that one. I'm going to move this. But there were various other government departments who came along. This was the age of the atomic bomb. It was not that long after the Second World War. And there were a lot of military people who said, wow, we could use this kind of thing, so military, and atomic. What can we call atomic stuff? It is military. But maybe we could be kind. I would like to say chemistry, but chemistry came on a lot later. I'm uncomfortable with this. I'm just going to say military. Okay, so that is it to IBM. Look, that's cool what you've done. You've produced a really good commercial computer. It uses numbers, but most of the numbers are just like whole numbers, like in the 128 or 596. How much money? $10,342 or something like that. Those kinds of numbers are called integers. And actually, just an integer is either a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or 5, or what have you. Okay? So, but for science, if you think about science is very often about, let's put a kind of one in here, physics. Now, if you think about physics, it's involved with the real world. And the real world isn't digital. The real world is wobbly, basically. The real world, if you do physics, pretty well everything in physics involves waves of one sort or another. I'll give you like sound. Now, sound, I'm talking to you. My mouth is wobbling the air, and that sound wave of wobbled air. So if I'm talking loudly, I'm pushing the air around quite a lot. If I'm not talking at all, the air's not being pushed around and it's silent. But these are waves. Now, you can describe those waves using mathematics as equations. And there are various equations. I'm not going to go into the science of what the equations are for this wobbliness, but equations are, well, you need numbers to be able to do calculations. But everywhere in this, this is called variables. And the bottom line on this, I'm going into too much detail. I'm not comfortable with detail. I want to sort of helicopter up a bit and say they were integers and floating point, or FP. Now, an example of a floating point number would be something like that. So there's the point, and it's 3.1425, or if I move the point, I could make that 31.425. So that is a floating point variable. So the computers needed to be able to handle integers and floating point numbers. And also in terms of characters, if we come back to characters, this all started off here, but the government wanted to be able to use upper and lowercase characters. If you think when you learn how to read at school, you have uppercase and lowercase. Ooh, where can I go? I think we'll pull this, pull that. Even Mr. Watson can go with IBM. So we're talking about characters now. And somebody said, well, we need a way of standardizing on the characters. We want to be able to hold character information on our cards. And they went to an organization called the American Standards Institute. I said, can you come up with a way of capturing character information on a computer? And they said, yeah, we can do that.
This is a critical decision point for you as you watch this IPL self-awareness course, because you're very probably thinking, I just do not want to know about computers. Why is this guy talking to me about numbers and integers and files and floating point and databases? And the reason for it is, what we're trying to do is give you a simple foundation from which you can understand human thoughts, because human thoughts go through certain paths in your mind. Our model of the four intelligences, how the subconscious and the conscious mind interact with each other, the whole business of self-talk and so on, is new. So hang in there, and we hope you stay with us.